Saturday morning started like so many others. The smell of coffee filled the air as sunlight poured through the kitchen windows. Olivia was already up, cheerful as she moved around in the anniversary dress I had given her just last week. She smiled warmly at me, planting a kiss on my cheek before mentioning an important meeting she had to attend. It wasn't unusual for her to have weekend commitments. Olivia's job often demanded her time, even outside the regular 9-to-5 grind. I had no reason to doubt her. Still, as she left the house earlier than expected, something felt off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. When Olivia returned that evening, she was tired but radiant, recounting her long day at the meeting and how her colleagues had dragged her to a bar afterward. Her voice was light, her laughter infectious, and yet, I couldn't shake the unease that had crept into my chest since she'd left that morning. As she poured us both a glass of wine, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was subtle, but I caught a glimpse of the notification. Ethan Ford. The name was unfamiliar, and for reasons I couldn't explain, it gnawed at me. I didn't ask about it then. What would I even say? But it lingered in my mind long after we went to bed. Olivia fell asleep quickly, her breaths even and calm, while I stared at the ceiling, turning the name over in my head like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. I tried to rationalize it the next morning. Ethan Ford could be a client, a coworker, or even an old friend. There was no reason to assume anything sinister. But as I replayed the events of the previous day, my mind kept circling back to the small inconsistencies, the sudden meeting, her earlier-than-usual departure, the unexplained cheerfulness when she returned. That afternoon, Olivia excused herself to run errands, leaving me alone in the house. Her phone sat on the counter, buzzing intermittently with notifications. I didn't pick it up. I wasn't that kind of husband. But the urge to look was undeniable, an itch I couldn't scratch. By the time Olivia returned, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. She greeted me with the same easy smile, her arms full of shopping bags. "I got some things for the house," she said, gesturing to the bags as though it was perfectly normal. And maybe it was. Maybe I was imagining the shift in her tone, the slight hesitation in her responses to my casual questions. Still, the name Ethan Ford lingered in the back of my mind, a shadow I couldn't ignore. That evening, as Olivia prepared dinner, I watched her from across the room. She moved with the same grace and confidence that had drawn me to her in the first place. To anyone else, she would have seemed like the perfect wife, attentive, cheerful, loving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. Later that night, after Olivia had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at my reflection in the darkened television screen. The doubts I had dismissed earlier now felt like they were clawing at the edges of my mind. Had I become paranoid? Or was there something more to this? I told myself I was imagining things, that Olivia would never betray me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just in my head. Something was wrong, and I was going to find out what. The days after that Saturday felt like a blur, a series of moments where I found myself second-guessing everything. Olivia was as cheerful and attentive as ever, but the subtle shifts in her behavior became harder to ignore. It started with her reactions. Simple questions about her day, her meetings, her plans, were met with answers that felt too polished, too rehearsed. Her tone was smooth, almost practiced, like she'd anticipated my inquiries. "Work was hectic," she'd say with a tired smile, avoiding eye contact as she rummaged through her bag. Or, "The team is pushing for deadlines, so I might have to stay late again." They weren't unreasonable explanations, but something about the way she said them felt off. One evening, as Olivia scrolled through her phone on the couch, I glanced over, hoping to catch a glimpse of what had her so engrossed. She tilted the screen away ever so slightly, a gesture so subtle it could have gone unnoticed. But I noticed. "What's got your attention?" I asked casually, trying to keep my tone light. "Just an article," she replied, setting the phone face down on the coffee table. Her smile was warm, her demeanor unbothered, but the action spoke volumes. The first major crack appeared a few days later when Olivia came home with a framed photograph. It was one of those artsy black and white shots she loved, taken at a work event. She placed it on the mantel with a proud smile. Look at this, she said, pointing to the image. The team had such a great time last week. The photo was innocuous enough, a group of her colleagues laughing at an elegant dinner party. But then my eyes landed on a man standing beside Olivia. His arm rested casually behind her, their smiles too familiar, too close. Who's that? I asked, nodding toward him. Oh, that's Ethan, she said breezily, as if the name meant nothing. He's on the marketing team. Really funny guy. Ethan. The name hit me like a cold gust of wind. Funny, huh? I said, keeping my voice neutral. She nodded, already moving on, as though her proximity to him in the photo was perfectly normal. But my mind latched onto it, refusing to let go. Over the next few days, I began noticing patterns. Olivia's schedule had changed subtly but noticeably. Her late nights were more frequent, her excuses more varied. Yoga ran long, she'd say, her hair suspiciously perfect for someone coming out of a workout class. Or, I grabbed a quick coffee with Sarah after work, though Sarah had mentioned earlier that week she was out of town. The inconsistencies stacked up, each one feeding the growing knot in my stomach. One night, as I scrolled through social media, I stumbled upon a post from one of Olivia's coworkers. It was a candid shot from the same dinner party. Olivia and Ethan were in the background, chatting closely, their heads tilted toward each other in what looked like an intimate conversation. I stared at the photo, my chest tightening. Was I reading too much into this? Or was there something more? When I showed Olivia the post, her reaction was swift and dismissive. Why are you so focused on that? She asked, laughing nervously. It's just a candid photo. Ethan and I were probably talking about the presentation. Her tone was light, but the flicker of annoyance in her eyes betrayed her. I was just curious, I said, trying to sound casual. You seemed pretty deep in conversation. Well, we weren't, she snapped, a sharpness in her voice I hadn't heard before. Can we drop it? I nodded, backing off, but the unease in my chest only grew. That night, as I lay in bed beside Olivia, I replayed the day's events in my mind. The photo, her reaction, the subtle defensiveness in her tone. It all pointed to something deeper, something she wasn't telling me. But what? I turned over, staring at the ceiling as Olivia's even breaths filled the room. She seemed so peaceful, so unbothered, while I wrestled with doubts that refused to let me rest. I wanted to believe her, to trust that the woman I had loved for years wouldn't betray me. But the cracks in her stories were growing wider, and the picture they painted wasn't one of innocence. For the first time, I began to question everything. Was this just a rough patch in our marriage, or was it something more sinister? The doubts I had pushed aside were now impossible to ignore, and I knew one thing for certain. I couldn't keep brushing this off. I needed to know the truth, and I was willing to do whatever it took to find it. It started as a passing thought, a way to quiet the doubts gnawing at my mind. After all, couples share everything these days. Calendars, location tracking apps, even passwords. It wasn't unusual. It wasn't invasive. It was practical. At least, that's how I justified the idea to myself. The thought first occurred to me during one of Olivia's increasingly frequent late nights. She had come home, her explanation rehearsed as usual. Another yoga class that ran late because of a chat with her instructor. Why don't we install a location tracking app on our phones? I suggested casually over dinner. It'd be useful in case of emergencies. You know, if we need to find each other quickly. Olivia froze for just a second. A flicker of hesitation so brief it could have been imagined. But I didn't imagine it. Why? She asked, her tone light but edged with something defensive. Do you think I'm going to get lost on my way to work? It's not about that, I said, trying to keep the mood casual. It's just, with how busy things get, it might be helpful. A little extra peace of mind. She laughed, but it felt forced. Alex, I think we're fine without it. Besides, isn't that a little much? I don't want to feel like I'm being tracked all the time. Her words stung, though she delivered them with a playful smile. There was no argument, no outright rejection, just a smooth deflection that left me with no ground to stand on. As the days passed, her reaction lingered in my mind. It wasn't that I wanted to invade her privacy, I just wanted reassurance. But her reluctance only deepened my suspicions. Why would she react like that unless she had something to hide? Then there were her increasingly creative excuses. Yoga classes morphed into impromptu dinners with coworkers. Errands turned into late-night shopping trips. One evening, as she slipped on her coat, I asked, "Heading out again?" She paused, her hand on the doorknob. "Yeah, I need to pick up some supplies for the watercolor class I joined." My brow furrowed. Watercolor class? Since when? She waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, I mentioned it a while ago. It's just something I've been trying out to unwind." I didn't remember her ever mentioning a watercolor class, but I let it slide. Still, the idea of her dabbling in something so out of character added to my growing unease. The next day, I decided to investigate. I looked up art studios in the area, searching for any that offered watercolor classes. It wasn't difficult to find one. There was a popular studio just a few miles away. Scrolling through their website, I stumbled across a flyer for a couples watercolor workshop. A knot tightened in my stomach. Couples workshop? Olivia hadn't mentioned anything about it being for couples. If anything, she'd implied it was a solo activity, something she was doing for herself. Was it a coincidence, or had she deliberately omitted that detail? The next time she mentioned the class, I decided to test her. "How's the watercolor going?" I asked casually. It must be fun learning with other people. She hesitated, her smile faltering for just a second. "Yeah, it's been great. Everyone's really friendly." I nodded, pretending not to notice the slight edge to her tone. "Do you paint with a partner? I read that some of those classes pair people up." She laughed nervously. "No, nothing like that. It's pretty laid back." Her response was smooth, but my doubts only deepened. Why was she lying? That night, as Olivia slept, I found myself scrolling through her phone again. The messages were clean, as they always were. No text from Ethan Ford, no suspicious conversations, nothing incriminating. But that only made me more uneasy. It was too clean, too perfect. And that's when I realized I couldn't rely on guesswork anymore. If I was going to get answers, I needed more than my own observations. The next morning, as Olivia left for work, I called the art studio. Pretending to be an interested customer, I inquired about their watercolor classes. "Do you offer anything for beginners?" I asked. "Of course," the woman on the other end said brightly. "We have individual classes, but our couple's watercolor workshop has been very popular lately." "And those are held when?" "Every Tuesday and Thursday evening," she replied. I felt the knot in my stomach tighten further. Tuesday and Thursday, the same nights Olivia had been claiming to attend yoga. "Thanks," I said, hanging up. My suspicions were no longer just doubts. They were starting to take shape. That evening, I watched Olivia get ready for her yoga class, my expression neutral as I asked, "Do you want me to drop you off?" She froze mid-step, a flicker of panic flashing in her eyes. "No, it's fine," she said quickly. "I'll drive myself." I nodded, forcing a smile. "Okay, have fun." As she left, I felt a mix of anger and determination. Whatever was going on, I was done giving her the benefit of the doubt. It was time to take action. The more I thought about the watercolor class, the more the pieces refused to fit together. Olivia had always been upfront about her hobbies, whether it was her yoga sessions or her brief interest in pottery years ago. This new passion for watercolor felt like an invention, something crafted to fill in gaps she didn't want me to see. Tuesday evening came quickly, and with it, Olivia's usual routine. She moved around the house, gathering her things with the ease of someone who thought her alibi was foolproof. "Heading out again?" I asked from the couch, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, same as always," she said with a smile. "Don't wait up. These classes sometimes run late." I nodded, watching her leave, the door clicking shut behind her. This time, I wasn't staying home. Once I was sure she was gone, I grabbed my keys and drove to the art studio she had mentioned. It was a quaint building tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, the type of place you'd imagine budding artists finding inspiration. I parked across the street and waited, watching the entrance as people trickled in. Couples. Every single person who entered was part of a couple. They arrived in pairs, holding hands, laughing as they carried their supplies. It wasn't definitive proof, But it confirmed one thing. Olivia wasn't painting alone. I stayed in the car for nearly an hour, my eyes fixed on the entrance. As much as I wanted to go inside and demand answers, I knew it wasn't the right time. If I confronted her without solid evidence, she'd find a way to twist it, to gaslight me into believing I was imagining things. Finally, as the session neared its end, I saw her. She stepped out of the studio with him, Ethan Ford. They were walking close, their voices low, their body language intimate in a way that sent a chill down my spine. I recognized him instantly from the photo I'd seen at the work event. He wasn't just a coworker or a casual acquaintance. He was something more. I sank lower in my seat, watching as they walked toward a nearby coffee shop. Olivia's laughter carried across the street, light and carefree. Ethan reached for the door, holding it open for her as she stepped inside. They stayed there for another hour. Through the coffee shop window, I could see them talking, leaning in closer as if the rest of the world didn't exist. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. When Olivia returned home later that night, her demeanor was the same as always. Cheerful, warm, entirely unbothered. "How was class?" I asked, testing the waters. "It was great," she said without hesitation. "We worked on shading and color blending. You know, the basics." She launched into a detailed description of the lesson, her words flowing smoothly, as if rehearsed. I nodded along, playing the part of the oblivious husband. Inside, my mind was racing. The following morning, I called the art studio again. This time, I asked about the couple's watercolor workshop. "Do participants have to sign up in pairs?" I asked. "Yes," the woman on the other end replied. "The whole point is to work together, so everyone registers with a partner." "And do you keep records of who signs up?" "Of course," she said brightly. "Would you like me to check availability?" I hung up before she could continue, my suspicions now confirmed. Olivia hadn't just been lying about the nature of the class. She had actively chosen to attend with Ethan. That evening, I debated confronting her. Part of me wanted to lay everything out, to demand answers and force her to admit the truth. But another part of me, the part that had been burned by her smooth lies before, knew better. I needed more than circumstantial evidence. I needed proof that she couldn't deny, something that would leave her no room to maneuver. So, I waited. Over the next few days, I kept my distance emotionally. Olivia seemed to notice, but didn't press the issue. If anything, my newfound detachment seemed to make her more comfortable, as if she believed I was finally letting go of my doubts. She left her phone unattended more often, her guard lowered by my feigned indifference. It wasn't much, but it gave me glimpses into her messages and calendar, each piece adding to the puzzle I was building. One night, as she showered, I scrolled through her phone again. The messages with Ethan were buried deep, hidden under layers of professional conversations and group chats. But they were there, coded in just enough ambiguity to maintain plausible deniability. "Ethan, same time Thursday?" "Olivia, wouldn't miss it." The message wasn't explicit, but it didn't have to be. The pattern was clear. I closed her phone and leaned back, the weight of my suspicions settling heavily on my chest. The truth was close, closer than it had ever been, but I wasn't ready to act just yet. Instead, I made a decision. If Olivia thought she was clever, she was about to learn otherwise. It was a Wednesday evening when everything finally began to unravel. Olivia had come home late again, her explanation rehearsed, her excuses piling up like bricks in a wall she was building to keep me out. This time, it wasn't yoga, errands, or watercolor class. "A colleague needed to vent," she said, brushing past me as she headed for the kitchen. "We grabbed a drink after work. Nothing major." But the smell of men's cologne hit me before her words did. Faint but distinct, and it wasn't mine. I followed her into the kitchen, watching as she poured herself a glass of wine, her movements casual, her demeanor unbothered. "Rough day?" I asked, keeping my voice even. She nodded, taking a sip. "You know how it is. Work can be exhausting. And the drink with your colleague? Did that help?" She paused, her eyes flickering toward me for just a moment before returning to her glass. "Yeah, it was nice to unwind. Nothing worth talking about." Her tone was light, dismissive, but I could feel the lie curling around her words. Interesting, I said, leaning against the counter, because I ran into Sarah the other day. She mentioned she's been out of town for a week. Olivia froze, her grip tightening around the stem of her glass. It was subtle, but I saw it, the crack in her composure. Oh, I didn't mean Sarah, she said quickly, her tone shifting. It was one of the newer hires. You don't know her, right? I said, nodding slowly. That makes sense. She relaxed slightly, misinterpreting my calm for acceptance. Later that night, as she showered, I found myself staring at her phone again. I hadn't touched it in days, trying to give her the illusion that I was backing off. But tonight, I couldn't resist. The messages were still clean, her text with Ethan buried deep beneath layers of casual conversations. But this time, I noticed something new, a calendar notification for the following evening. Dinner with EF, 7 p.m. EF. Ethan Ford. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen, the confirmation staring back at me. It wasn't just my imagination. She wasn't just hiding something. She was hiding him. The next evening, I sat on the couch, pretending to watch TV as Olivia got ready to leave. She wore a dress I hadn't seen in months, her makeup flawless, her hair styled just enough to suggest she wasn't trying too hard. Heading out again? I asked, my tone casual. Yeah, she said, slipping on her heels. Just a quick dinner with some colleagues. Don't wait up. She kissed me on the cheek and walked out the door, her scent lingering in the air long after she'd gone. As soon as she left, I grabbed my keys and followed. I kept my distance, my car blending into the stream of traffic as I trailed her to a restaurant downtown. It was a cozy, upscale place, intimate, with dim lighting and a quiet atmosphere. She parked and walked inside, her confidence unmistakable. A few minutes later, Ethan arrived. He stepped out of his car, adjusting his tie before following her into the restaurant. I stayed in my car, watching from a safe distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel. They sat near the window, their conversation animated, their body language unguarded. I couldn't hear them, but I didn't need to. The way she leaned in when she laughed, the way he reached across the table to touch her hand, it was all the confirmation I needed. For the next hour, I watched as they ate, drank, and shared stolen moments that should have been mine. By the time they left, I felt like I'd been hollowed out, every doubt and suspicion replaced by the cold, hard truth. When Olivia returned home later that night, she was in high spirits, her smile bright, her laughter easy. How was your evening? I asked as she kicked off her heels. Good, she said, stretching as she walked toward the bedroom. Just work stuff, nothing exciting. I nodded, biting back the words threatening to spill out. Glad to hear it, I said, my voice calm, even as my chest burned with anger. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling as Olivia slept beside me. The truth was out, but the question remained. What was I going to do about it? Confronting her in the heat of the moment would give her an escape, a way to twist the narrative, to paint herself as the victim. I couldn't let that happen. I needed to be smart. I needed to be methodical. This wasn't just about exposing her lies. It was about reclaiming control of my life. The weight of what I'd witnessed over the past few days was crushing, but I didn't let it show. Every time Olivia smiled at me or shared a fabricated detail about her day, I responded in kind, my mask firmly in place. Confrontation wasn't the answer. Not yet. If I was going to uncover the full extent of her betrayal, I needed more than just my observations. It was time to bring in someone who could help. The decision to hire a private investigator didn't come easily. I spent hours deliberating, pacing the living room long after Olivia had gone to bed. Was this the right move? Was I crossing a line I couldn't return from? But every time I thought about her laughter at the restaurant, her easy lies, and the man who sat across from her as though I didn't exist, my resolve hardened. I needed answers, and I couldn't trust her to give them to me. The next morning, while Olivia was at work, I searched for a private investigator. After scrolling through countless reviews and recommendations, I settled on someone who came highly recommended, Carter Investigations. I called the number, my heart pounding as it rang. Carter Investigations, a calm, professional voice answered. Hi, My name is Alex, I said, hesitating slightly. I need help with a personal matter. There was a pause on the other end. What kind of matter? I took a deep breath. I think my wife is having an affair. I need someone to confirm it. By the end of the call, I had arranged a meeting with Mr. Carter, the lead investigator. His voice had been steady and reassuring, his questions direct but not invasive. He explained how the process worked: discreet surveillance, thorough documentation, and absolute confidentiality. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't about the money. It was about the truth. The following day, I met Mr. Carter at a small, nondescript office downtown. He was a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, the kind of person who could blend into any crowd without drawing attention. "Tell me everything you know," he said, pulling out a notepad. I recounted everything: the late nights, the suspicious messages, the watercolor class incident, and the dinner with Ethan. When I finished, Carter nodded thoughtfully. "It sounds like there's already a pattern here. We'll start with basic surveillance and build from there. If there's something to uncover, we'll find it." Over the next few days, I waited anxiously for updates. Carter's team followed Olivia's movements, documenting her daily routine. At first, the reports were mundane: work, errands, yoga, nothing unusual. But then, a pattern began to emerge. "She's meeting with Ethan Ford," Carter said during our first update call. "Twice this week, at the same cafe. They're keeping it casual, but there's definitely something there." My stomach churned as he continued. "They haven't done anything overt yet, but we're keeping a close eye. If it escalates, we'll be ready." The updates became a strange source of both relief and dread. On one hand, I finally had confirmation that my suspicions weren't unfounded. On the other hand, every new detail felt like a knife to the heart. One evening, Carter called with an important development. "She's told him she'll have more freedom soon," he said. "She mentioned something about you being out of town for a work trip. Does that sound familiar?" I clenched my jaw, realizing she must have been referring to my upcoming conference. "Yes," I said, my voice tight. "I told her I'd be away next week." "Good," Carter said. "That gives us an opportunity. We'll monitor her movements while you're gone and see if they take things further." The week leading up to my trip was surreal. Olivia acted as though everything was normal, even affectionate at times. She kissed me goodbye in the mornings, texted me throughout the day, and cooked dinner in the evenings. But beneath the surface, I knew the truth. Her smiles were calculated, her affection a facade designed to keep me off her trail. It almost worked. Almost. The night before I left for the conference, I stood in the doorway of our bedroom, watching as Olivia packed an overnight bag. "Big plans while I'm gone?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She glanced up, smiling. "Just the usual. Work, yoga, maybe a movie night with the girls." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Sounds nice. Don't have too much fun without me." She laughed, but I caught the flicker of something in her eyes. Guilt, perhaps, or hesitation. The next morning, I left for the conference, my heart heavy but my mind clear. I wasn't just leaving for work. I was leaving to see what Olivia would do when she thought I wasn't watching. Carter and his team were ready. They knew her routine, her haunts, her patterns. All I had to do was wait. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing I had reached a point where I couldn't trust my own wife. But the alternative, living in ignorance, allowing her lies to go unchecked, was far worse. I was ready for the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The first day of my work trip passed in a haze of unease and anticipation. I wasn't at the conference. There was no conference. Instead, I had checked into a small hotel in a neighboring town, far enough to keep up the ruse, but close enough to be in control. Mr. Carter and his team wasted no time. By the time I settled into my room, they were already following Olivia's movements. The first update came that evening. "She left the house around 7, Carter reported. "She drove to a familiar spot, the cafe she frequents with Ethan Ford." I gripped the phone tightly, my jaw clenching. "And him? Is he there?" "He showed up about 10 minutes after she did," Carter confirmed. "They're sitting at the back, away from the main crowd. Nothing too physical yet, but they're definitely more than just co-workers." Carter's words hung in the air long after the call ended. Hearing the confirmation felt both validating and crushing. For days, I had suspected this was where things were heading, but now there was no denying it. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning as my mind replayed the events of the day. I could picture them sitting together, laughing, leaning closer as the hours ticked by. The next morning, I called Carter for an update. They stayed at the cafe for about an hour and a half, he said. Afterward, they walked to her car. He hugged her before she left. A hug? I repeated, my voice laced with bitterness. For now, Carter said carefully, but this isn't just casual. The body language, the familiarity, it's clear there's something deeper. The second day of surveillance followed a similar pattern. Olivia left the house in the evening, claiming she was meeting the girls for a movie night. Carter's team tailed her as she drove to the same restaurant where I had first spotted her and Ethan. They're at a booth in the corner, Carter said during his nightly update. Sharing a bottle of wine this time. What else? I pressed, my stomach twisting. They're flirting, Alex. It's subtle, but it's there. She touched his arm when she laughed, and he leaned in close when he spoke. They're comfortable with each other. By the third day, the picture was becoming painfully clear. Olivia wasn't just lying to me. She was living a double life. Carter's call that evening was both anticipated and dreaded. They left the restaurant and drove to a secluded park, he said, his tone professional but not devoid of sympathy. They walked along a trail for about 20 minutes before stopping near a bench. My chest tightened. And they kissed, Carter said bluntly. It wasn't brief, Alex. They're involved. The words hit me like a sledgehammer, knocking the wind out of me. I had spent days bracing for this moment, telling myself I was ready for the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. The silence on the other end of the line stretched uncomfortably. Alex, Carter prompted. I'm here, I said finally, my voice hoarse. What happened after? She drove him back to his car, Carter continued. They talked for a bit before parting ways. No signs of an overnight meeting, yet, but the pattern is escalating. That night, I sat in my hotel room, staring blankly at the wall. The images Carter described played vividly in my mind. Olivia and Ethan walking together, their kiss under the cover of darkness, her betrayal laid bare. I had suspected. I had investigated. I had prepared myself for the worst. But the reality of it, the undeniable, unchangeable truth, was suffocating. The next morning, Carter called with an update that pushed me further toward the edge. She mentioned your absence, he said. Told Ethan she's relieved to have some space for a few days. The words stung like a slap to the face. Anything else? She hinted at seeing him again tonight, Carter said. We'll keep following. I spent the day pacing the small hotel room, my emotions swinging between anger, sadness, and numb determination. Every moment Olivia spent with Ethan felt like a betrayal of the life we had built together, the trust we had shared. By the time Carter's nightly call came, I was ready for whatever he had to tell me. They met again, he said. Same park as before. This time, they stayed longer, about 2 hours. And let's just say it wasn't just kissing this time. I felt the ground shift beneath me. The final line had been crossed. That night, I stared at my phone, Carter's words echoing in my mind. Olivia and Ethan had gone from flirting to something physical, and all the while, she had been coming home to me, pretending nothing was wrong. I knew the truth now. I had the evidence. But the question remained. What was I going to do with it? The time for passive observation was over. It was time to act. By the morning after Carter's final update, my resolve was solidified. Olivia's betrayal wasn't just a fleeting mistake. It was a calculated, deliberate choice that she'd repeated over and over again. The evidence was undeniable, and now, I had everything I needed to confront her. But a simple confrontation wouldn't be enough. Olivia was a master at spinning words, deflecting blame, and painting herself as the victim. If I walked into this without a plan, she'd twist the narrative until I was the one apologizing. This wasn't going to be an argument. This was going to be an exposure. I called Carter that afternoon, outlining my next steps. Send me everything, I said. Every photo, every video, Every piece of evidence you've gathered. You sure about this? Carter asked, his tone cautious. Once you show your hand, there's no going back. I'm sure, I replied, my voice steady. It's time she faces the truth. Over the next 48 hours, I pieced together the story of Olivia's betrayal. Every photograph of her with Ethan, every timestamp video, every screenshot of their movements, it all painted a damning picture. I organized the evidence meticulously, creating a timeline that left no room for ambiguity. At the center of it all was the kiss in the park. That was the turning point, the irrefutable proof that Olivia had broken the vows we made to each other. Once the evidence was compiled, I began planning the confrontation. The first step was ensuring I had control of the situation. I needed to choose the time, the place, and the narrative. After much deliberation, I decided on a neutral location. A quiet restaurant where Olivia wouldn't feel cornered enough to lash out, but wouldn't have the freedom to escape. I made a reservation for Saturday evening, texting Olivia that morning, let's have dinner tonight. It's been a while since we had a proper date night. Olivia, that sounds great. I'll book the sitter. Can't wait, Redheart. Her response was enthusiastic, almost too much so. It was the response of someone who believed they still had the upper hand. That evening, as Olivia got ready, I watched her carefully. She hummed to herself as she applied her makeup, her expression relaxed and content. She didn't know what was coming. You look beautiful, I said as she slipped on her shoes. She smiled, turning to me. You're sweet. It's been so long since we had a night like this. I'm glad you suggested it. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. Me too. The restaurant was quiet and intimate, the kind of place Olivia loved. She was in high spirits as we ordered, chatting about work and upcoming plans. I let her talk, responding where necessary but keeping my focus on the moment. When the food arrived, I set my fork down and looked at her, my heart pounding in my chest. Olivia, I said, my voice steady. There's something I need to talk to you about. Her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Of course. What's on your mind? I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. Opening the folder of evidence, I slid it across the table toward her. Take a look, I said. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the phone as if she already knew what she'd find. When she finally picked it up, her expression changed almost immediately. The photos of her with Ethan, the videos of their meetings, the kiss in the park, it was all there, undeniable and unfiltered. Alex, she began, her voice shaking. This isn't. Don't, I interrupted, my tone sharp. Don't insult me by pretending this isn't what it looks like. Her face crumpled, her composure cracking under the weight of the evidence. I can explain. No, I said firmly. You've had months to explain. You had chances to tell me the truth, and you chose to lie. Over and over again. For the first time in our marriage, Olivia was speechless. The confident, self-assured woman who could talk her way out of anything was reduced to silence. What were you thinking? I demanded, my voice rising. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That I wouldn't notice? Tears filled her eyes as she shook her head. Alex, I'm so sorry. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Wasn't supposed to happen? I repeated, my anger boiling over. Then what was it supposed to be? A secret you took to your grave? The conversation that followed was painful, filled with half-hearted excuses and desperate apologies. Olivia admitted to the affair, but tried to minimize its significance, claiming it was a mistake, a moment of weakness. I didn't buy it. You don't accidentally meet someone at a park, I said coldly. You don't accidentally kiss them. This wasn't a mistake, Olivia. This was a choice. Your choice. By the time we left the restaurant, the dynamic of our relationship had shifted irrevocably. Olivia was broken, her facade shattered, while I felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity. The ride home from the restaurant was eerily silent. Olivia sat in the passenger seat, her tear-streaked face turned toward the window. She didn't say a word, and I didn't bother to break the silence. My mind was racing with everything that had transpired, the weight of her betrayal sinking deeper into my chest with each passing moment. When we arrived home, she hesitated at the front door, as if unsure whether she was still welcome. I unlocked it without a word, stepping inside and leaving her to follow. Alex, she started, her voice trembling. Not now, I said, cutting her off. I need space. I didn't wait for her response. Instead, I went straight to the guest room, closing the door behind me. For the first time in our marriage, we slept in separate rooms, the distance between us symbolic of the chasm that had formed in our relationship. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of Olivia moving around the kitchen. She had always been an early riser, but today, her usual energy was replaced by a subdued stillness. I entered the room, my presence startling her. "Good morning," she said cautiously, placing a mug of coffee on the counter. I ignored the pleasantries, leaning against the counter as I watched her. "We need to talk." Her shoulders sagged, but she nodded, gesturing for me to sit at the table. For the next hour, I let her speak, spilling everything she claimed was the truth. She admitted to the affair with Ethan, detailing how it had started as a harmless friendship that had gotten out of hand. She spoke about feeling neglected, about how my focus on work had made her feel invisible. Her excuses came thick and fast, each one twisting the knife a little deeper. "I never meant to hurt you, Alex," she said, her voice breaking. "I made a mistake. I was stupid, and I'm sorry." I studied her, my expression unreadable. "You didn't just hurt me, Olivia. You destroyed the trust we built. Do you even realize that?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded. "I do, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix this. Please, Alex, give me another chance." Her plea hung in the air, and for a moment, I considered it. But then I remembered everything. The lies, the late nights, the kiss in the park. Forgiveness felt like a foreign concept, something I wasn't sure I was capable of anymore. "I don't know if there's anything left to fix," I said finally. Olivia's face crumpled, but I stood firm. Over the next few days, the house felt like a battlefield. Olivia tried everything to win me back, cooking my favorite meals, leaving me notes of apology, even suggesting therapy. But my resolve remained unshaken. I contacted my lawyer, initiating the steps toward divorce. The process was painful but necessary. Olivia didn't contest my decision, though her heartbreak was evident. "I can't believe it's come to this," she said one evening as we sat across from each other in the living room. "Neither can I replied. "But this is the reality you created, Olivia." As the legal proceedings progressed, the evidence Carter had gathered became invaluable. The photos, videos, and texts painted a clear picture of her betrayal, leaving no room for dispute. Ethan, too, faced the fallout. I sent the evidence to his wife, Olivia, ensuring she knew the truth about her husband's actions. Her response was swift and decisive. She filed for divorce within days, exposing Ethan's infidelity to their entire social circle. The ripple effect of Olivia and Ethan's choices spread far and wide. Their affair became the talk of the neighborhood, whispers and rumors following them wherever they went. Olivia withdrew from her usual social activities, too ashamed to face the judgment of those around her. I, on the other hand, began to feel a sense of liberation. The burden of her lies was gone, replaced by the clarity of knowing I had done everything I could to salvage our marriage. One evening, as I packed the last of my belongings, Olivia approached me. "Alex," she said softly, "I know I don't deserve it, but do you think you'll ever forgive me?" I met her gaze, searching for the sincerity in her words. "I don't know, Olivia. Maybe one day. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting." She nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I'm so sorry for everything." "I know," I said, "but sorry doesn't undo what's been done." That night, as I closed the door to our home for the last time, I felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness for what we had lost, but relief for what I had gained. The freedom to start over, unburdened by her betrayal. It wasn't the ending I had envisioned for us, but it was the one I needed. The morning sun streamed through the windows of my new apartment, painting the walls with golden light. It was a far cry from the house I had shared with Olivia, but that was precisely why it felt right. The space was modest yet warm, a blank slate where I could begin to rebuild. For the first time in what felt like forever, I woke up without the crushing weight of betrayal pressing on my chest. The divorce had been finalized, the papers signed and sealed, and Olivia was now nothing more than a chapter in my past. My days took on a new rhythm, one dictated by my choices and my priorities. Work became a haven, a place where I could channel my energy and focus on what truly mattered. My colleagues, who had rallied around me during the fallout, noticed the change. "You seem lighter these days," one of them remarked during lunch. "I guess I finally let go of what was holding me back," I replied with a small smile. It was true. The Alex who had tolerated lies, excuses, and neglect was gone. In his place stood a man who had reclaimed his dignity and self-worth. Outside of work, I began exploring parts of life I had neglected during my marriage. I signed up for cooking classes, something I had always wanted to try but never made time for. I joined a local hiking group, finding solace in the quiet beauty of nature. It was during one of these hikes that I met Claire. She was a photographer, her camera always slung around her neck, capturing moments others might overlook. We struck up a conversation as the group rested at a scenic overlook. "You seem to be lost in thought," she said, lowering her camera to study me. "Just taking it all in," I replied, gesturing to the sprawling landscape before us. She smiled, her eyes warm and curious. "Sometimes, starting over gives you a new perspective, doesn't it?" I nodded, surprised by how accurately her words reflected my own journey. Over the following weeks, Claire and I grew closer. She had an easygoing nature that made her company feel effortless, and for the first time since the divorce, I found myself looking forward to spending time with someone. She didn't pry into my past or push me to share more than I was ready to. Instead, she focused on the present, on building something meaningful without the weight of old wounds. One evening, as we walked through the park, she paused to snap a photo of a couple sitting on a bench, their laughter filling the air. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, glancing at the image on her camera. "It is," I agreed, though my gaze lingered on her more than the scene she had captured. Claire turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think you'll ever fully let go of the past?" I considered her question for a moment. "I think it's less about letting go and more about learning from it. The past shapes us, but it doesn't have to define us." Her smile widened. "I like that." As the months passed, my life began to feel like my own again. The apartment was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a home, filled with memories I was creating on my terms. The whispers about Olivia and Ethan faded, replaced by silence as they dealt with the fallout of their choices. I no longer cared about what they were doing or where they had ended up. That part of my life was over, and I had no intention of looking back. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I came across a photo of Olivia and me from our wedding day. We looked happy, hopeful, and entirely unaware of what the future held. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness, not for her, but for the life we could have had if things had been different. Then, with a deep breath, I placed the photo back in the box and pushed it aside. My relationship with Claire continued to grow, her presence a reminder that there was life after betrayal. She taught me to see beauty in the everyday, to appreciate the small moments that often went unnoticed. One evening, as we watched the sunset from her rooftop, she turned to me and said, "You seem at peace now." "I think I finally am," I replied, my voice steady. The next day, I received an email inviting me to speak at a local event about resilience and starting over. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months ago, I wouldn't have considered myself resilient. But now, standing on the other side of betrayal, I realized just how much strength it had taken to rebuild my life. I accepted the invitation, eager to share my story and inspire others to find their own path forward. As I stood on the stage weeks later, looking out at the crowd, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't known before. Betrayal can break you, I began, my voice steady, but it can also teach you who you are and what you're capable of. It's not the end. It's a chance to start over, to build something stronger, something real. The audience listened intently, their expressions reflecting the emotions I had once felt. That night, as I returned to my apartment, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer consumed me. It had become a part of my story, a chapter that had led me to this moment. Raising my glass to the skyline, I whispered, Here's to new beginnings. And with that, I turned off the lights and stepped into the future, ready for whatever came next.